husband almost wore that this morning. The way he handed it to me, I almost lost it. And then he would have been so sad.
Mm-hmm.
Nope, it's probably ribs.
And closed
If the moon,
the
What
place
about bad
in
with
which
the-
he
oh,
took
spare
the
ribs? Would you eat it? I know I would. What? It's a Saturday Night Live skit. Will Ferrell. He's playing Harry Carey. If the moon is made out of spare ribs, would you eat it? I know I would.
Some people think the moon is made out of cheese.
What was that about?
That would
I
require a
involved
lot
human
of
brain.
barbecue sauce.
It was about physical
It also
violence,
says right
Justin.
here, he took the ribs and closed it up. The place
Look who's
from
here.
which he took the flesh as well.
Oh my
How long
gosh.
you here for?
Saturday.
Someone decided to give you Thanksgiving off?
Yeah.
Are you throwing off Hannah's routine?
Hannah's, for sure. Disrupting it big time.
You driving to the point, David?
I thought it was interesting because the help me situation.
How's the fishing going up there?
Fishing's good. We're getting our pounds, which is nice.
Happy birthday.
Price is about half as much as it was last year, though. So that's a bummer.
Is there a tariff on that?
It's not necessarily the tariff, because when they lifted a lot of the tariffs that they had on us, the price didn't go up. So we're not too sure. I mean, it's Chinese economy, it's bad. Just market's just bad.
I thought they were going to have any more birthdays. But like, it's more
We deal with
I thought you were going to say
high-end, like luxury seafood versus just normal day-and-day seafood. So it's like it's gonna take a hit.
You gonna be okay?
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah, I'm paying off debt. So
Making money?
I did not bring them in.
That makes Hannah happy.
yeah. It does.
Yeah,
But now I have a job.
I don't want to be stuck with Helen Oak.
Oh no, you're
Oh.
you're
I'm afraid of this idea.
That's about the most selfish statement I've heard this morning.
You
Don't
did it
leave
to
me
your
with
dad,
this
look
wood.
what happened.
I don't care if you're doing okay. I just want I want to get rid of my wood.
Are you sure? I don't believe you. I think he braided his hair and now he has.
I know. I don't think you're selfish.
Then how do you have it?
Actually, you got a friend?
Well, no more so than the rest of us. How about that? Just ask my Yeah. Any of our wives would say, that guy? If I'd only known before I married him. Except for Anna, of course.
She got really lucky.
Dude, I think the shoe's on the other foot.
Corey,
Might as well
What
just.
time do we start? It's been forever.
I can't believe you let him braid your hair like that and now you have one.
Oh yeah, that's
I'll
why
be right back.
braided it all out.
That's what
I
just
can't
told
add
him.
merino
He said,
crumbs
"No,
to
It's
glitter."
been that way since he was a kid and he shaved it off himself.
He's been asking for his head to be shaped like mine.
He wants to be twin.
Surprising.
I like that color on you, Laura.
Thank you.
It's nice.
Green.
Grinch green.
I didn't
No,
think of
it's a little
that.
bit more yellow.
Oh,
It
that's
was
Grinch green all day.
No, that is Grinch green. I agree with Corey. That's Grinch green.
No, a little bit more yellow.
How's your eyes doing?
terribly because I've been looking at colors all yesterday.
Were you in the paint section yesterday?
Yes, and garden section.
Is
Oh,
it
joy.
locked? It is,
Is
of
it
course, locked.
because you're looking at them or because you're smelling them?
All I can smell is pine.
It is unlocked. Lock it when you grab them out of the back seat.
Who's in charge of the plan?
Why would it's in water? It's exactly that one, right? Gotta be maybe the trees and put a little bit of sunlight that one gets.
Justin and Jennifer, Magumi said good morning to you guys.
I didn't hear.
Sorry.
No, she waved to
morning.
you guys.
She did say the word morning.
I say good morning.
No one can hear
It's
me.
sorry.
I'm sorry.
Oh, that's just mean.
Well, it's the truth.
I know it's the truth, but still. That's still mean.
Trying to be rude. Wasn't trying to be rude.
Oh,
And what did you do?
can you give that back to Laura? Can I give it back to Laura? Let's give it back to Laura. Laura, here's the flower again. She only took one.
There was only one.
No, there's two.
Oh, two.
Two kisses.
Is that all there is?
Hooray.
Hold on. One, two, three, four.
Someone like, ooh.
Green. We are very limited on the Tic Tacs today. What happened? Did you eat them all?
That's cute.
I eat all the Tic Tacs. Sorry, kids. Like your shoes.
No.
Then get in the nursery. Oh, no. They found it. Okay, good.
Smell off.
Or-
Good as well.
Yeah. Almost urine smell to it.
Thanks, Jeff.
Can I bring you a chair?
What if I had to eat all the Tic Tacs? I think I would
Sibby.
very well irritate.
That might be me
That
too.
down back.
Madeline, Mrs. Magumi wants.
It was really great, right?
Sibylle.
That might be why she's not here.
No, that's not one.
Oh, probably.
I love your dress. Yes, I do. Yes, she is.
Oh, that poor baby.
It is.
My son,
Hey, you guys have Sunday school or what?
I'm going.
Yeah, it's time for Sunday school. Hey, Kayla, it's Sunday school. You did not.
There's not one.
You did.
There's an off button.
Valerie's gonna kill you. Come on.
Is that your voice recording?
No, and my mom bought it for me and sent it to me
It's gonna be stuck in
like
my
the
brain
day
forever.
before.
You're lucky.
Because I'm hearing something. I'm hearing something. It
No,
says
it's
that.
not even great.
toy.
It's a toy that says aloha.
Aloha.
Aloha, pola, jola, jolly on Christmas.
All right.
Everyone say.
Let's
Time to
get
pay attention.
started.
What?
Oh, that's. You're not in the military.
Did you turn it back on? I just turned it off. I didn't teach you how to turn it back on.
Jeff taught her how to turn it on.
I did that.
He is a fool.
Who's teaching the kids Sunday school?
They're self-governing.
Sarah.
I think Sarah's doing the older kids, right?
Yeah, and then Valerie's with the younger ones.
Oh, Belle's here this one. All right. Magumi, once you get seated, you mind opening this up for her? Don't sound too excited.
Sure. Dear Father, thank you so much for bringing us together. And thank you for our help. Please help those that are working today and also
pass out some scriptures to read, if we get to them. All right. Holly, would you mind jotting down or remembering Galatians 4:30 through 5, Galatians chapter 4, verse 30 through chapter 5, verse 1.
Okay.
And then chapter 5, verse 12 through 13. Megumi, 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 15 through 18.
2 Corinthians chapter 3.
Verse 15 through 18.
Okay.
And then Paul, John chapter 8, verse 30 and 31. 30 and 31. All right, quick recap. So we've been going through the, is my mic on? No. Yes. There we go. How's that? Good. So we've been going through the history of the church. And we've been going through Roman history. Why do you think it's important to understand Roman history? Why are we going through Roman history when we're talking about the history of the church?
Because they were, at that time, the Christians were affected by that.
I could not hear you.
The government at that time was Rome.
Okay. Any other good reasons why we should go through the history of Rome when we're talking about the history of the church?
Well, it's interesting that we focus on Roman history. Probably because of the fact that what came out of it was that eventually you got the Catholic Church out of it, and that became the predominant church for a long time before you had the splits with the Protestants, and then you had other split-offs. There's no real focus on the Christians that head out to other parts of the world, like to Africa, or head further east.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yep. So I wanted to pull in Roman history for, we'll see the influence it has on church lineage and how it influences churches. And also as I study Rome, I think that God used Rome. It was the way that Rome came about and its influence around its territory, I think set up for the spread of Christianity. And I'll get in briefly as to why that is. But just do a quick recap. So we've been going through the emperors and just briefly looking at the state of Judea during this time period. So we're talking around the turn of the century. And I think we've gotten up to roughly 130 AD. And so, anybody remember leading up to the turn of the century, what was, let's ask this question, what were the three primary factions within Judea, within the Jews? Anybody remember? Two of them should be pretty easy.
Pharisees, Sadducees, and the Zealots.
Well, Zealots came out of the Pharisees, so the Essenes, yeah. And actually, in our game on Wednesday, you know, the Essenes came up on one of the quiz questions. You guys remember what that question was?
Those are the ones that
Had to deal with the Dead Sea Scrolls. Yeah. And then you mentioned the Zealots, so, you know, after the Pharisees kind of became well established after the Maccabean revolt in 167, I believe, BC. And out of the Pharisees, a more rigorous group came out called the Zealots. And then even out of the Zealots, you have a very anti-Hellenistic group called the Sicarii. If you remember them, they were essentially assassins. So off and on again through the next couple hundred years, the Jews, you know, go through revolts and clear out the Roman influence within Judea, and then, you know, Rome answers in kind, comes in and restores their dominance. Oh, sorry. And during that time period, my clicker's dead. Oh, there we go.
Is that little ON OFF switch there?
Yeah. So, getting into Nero, if you remember him, he was a pretty nasty emperor, persecuted Christians pretty heavily, very immoral.
for 42 months.
And then you have the Sicarii, who wiped out the Roman influence within Judea, and then once Rome came back, they were pushed up to the Madara, I believe that's called. That's their compound.
Where was that?
So that was yeah, Masada, sorry. So that's north of Jerusalem, I believe. So they were pushed up to this compound where,
According
you
to
know,
the map, it's south.
is it south? Yeah, you're right.
That's
That's right.
south end of the Dead Sea, pretty much.
Yeah. So they basically fortified themselves in for a couple of years. Rome spent a lot of effort trying to clear them out, and once they finally gained entrance, they all of the Sicarii had essentially committed mass suicide. But currently, that's modern day image. So the IDF, Israeli IDF, used to hold ceremonies there. You know, when their soldiers would graduate from whatever they call it, basic camp, they would hold their ceremonies up there. So you got Galba, Alto. So if you remember the year of the four emperors, so you go through Nero, and then you go through Galba, who was in for a few months. He's assassinated by Otho. Otho takes the reign, he's killed, and then you get Vitellius. He is killed, and then we enter into the Flavian dynasty. So, if you remember, Vespasian had ordered his son Titus to wipe out, or basically bring back under control, Jerusalem during a revolt in 69, I believe, 68. maybe it was 70. And so on Titus was on his way to go take back Jerusalem, and got word that Vespasian had passed, so he had to divert back to Rome to take on the throne. So Jerusalem's left to, it's a lot of internal revolts. So the Zealots, who were against any Greek-speaking Jew, anybody who was Greek or Hellenized, they were, leading the effort to push them out of Jerusalem. So they were persecuting Jews and Romans, citizens. And so once Titus takes the reign, he goes into Jerusalem and tells his legion to bring Jerusalem under control. Leading up to this, the Jews, the Zealots, had ambushed one of the Roman legions and wiped them out. And that legion was primarily made up of Syrians and Arabs, because the way that leading around this time period, it was rare for a Roman citizen to actually enter into the military. It used to be a noble, it was the thing that Roman citizens did. The higher class you were, that's where we get our term equestrian. If you were wealthy enough to own horses, then you would enter in as cavalry, which was like the highest position within the military. If you were upper to middle class, you would, be like a shield bearer. You were, wealthy enough to afford armor and shields. And then if you were lower class, you were essentially like a infantryman, so you had swords. So around this time period, it became less and less popular for Roman citizens to actually enter into the military. So most of the legions were made up of, the population that they had conquered. So this legion that the Jews had ambushed were made up of Arabs and Syrians, and they did not take kindly to the ambush. So when Titus brought these legions to Jerusalem to bring it back under control, he told them to not, don't go overboard. Our purpose,
If we're gonna correct history correctly, we need to call them Palestinians.
well, not yet. It hasn't been named Palestine yet.
That's what they are, of course.
So tells his soldiers, our objective is to bring Jerusalem back under control. In their anger, they completely go overboard. They wipe out most of the Jews in the area, and they destroy the temple.
Oh yeah, that's a little brutal.
Yeah. So then, after Titus passes, his brother Vespasian takes the reign. He kind of lived in the shadows of Titus. He was one of the worst emperors in Rome, also immoral. I believe he had a relationship. Well, I won't speak out of turn without going back and reading, but so he was pretty corrupt. Oops.
Oh, sorry. Fixing the sound. Go ahead.
So then you have Nerva, who was like their old uncle. He was a pretty level-headed ruler. So if you remember, that's all right. Going back to Vespasian, if you remember, he implemented laws against the Jews. They would have to prove that they were a Jew by dropping their doors, and Vespasian persecuted both Jews and Jewish sympathizers. So there was kind of a split within the church. Those who denied, because you were persecuted if you were even thought to support the Jews. So, as a Christian, you had to make the decision whether or not, because you're already under persecution for being a Christian. So in your trial, the question was posed: do you support the Jews or not? So you had to make a decision: do I still support God's people or do I not?
Just the one.
So he implemented laws against the Jews, overtaxation against them. And then Nerva came in and basically reversed that. He made it a little more lax for the Jews, although local governors were still, persecuting them, persecuting Christians. And then we're in Trajan. Who's next after that? Yeah, so Trajan. You get Trajan, and then Trajan basically was the zenith of the Roman Empire, so he expanded territory. And that was essentially the apex of Rome. And then I believe we left off with Hadrian. So Hadrian took the opposite tact of Trajan. So he wanted to essentially withdraw Rome. He felt like they were overexpanding themselves. So he withdrew a lot of the Roman territory and firmed up their defenses. So he took a more defensive tack than an offensive tack. So the Senate did not agree with that. They hated Trajan. And so upon his death, they, sorry, Jeff. All right. So upon Hadrian's death, although if you remember, so in his effort to firm up their defenses, the prior emperors had spent a lot of effort trying to overtake the Britannia, and once they reached north, they always had struggles. So Hadrian basically put a stop to that and built the wall. They did. So during this time, looking at the history of the church, one important thing to note, so in Rome it was a sign of your class. A lot of the social class, how you would demonstrate, your wealth and how important you were, was by the number of slaves you owned. So, the wealthy 1%ers would have a slave to do almost every menial task. So they would have a slave to accept people into their home. They'd have a slave to show the guests to their seating area. They'd have a slave that was dedicated for setting a table, a slave dedicated for removing or emptying the table. Every almost menial task had a slave associated with it. Their economy, was essentially structured around slaves, and it got to the point where in this time period we're looking at, 130, 140, 150 time frame, almost half of Rome were slaves. So, that when you read about Rome and how they, were one of the few empires to essentially lax their treatment of slaves, you could think, well, they were very progressive in their politics. They valued slaves, but ultimately it was because they feared a revolt against the slaves. If the slaves raised up, there'd be little chance that Rome would survive that, given that almost half their population were slaves. And so, in their slaves, there were typically three ways in which you became a slave. You were either born to a slave, which was kind of rare because, as a slave, you didn't really have time
you know, to have any romantic relationships. What?
Unless it was with your boss.
Yeah. Or you were, you know, of one of the conquered nations. So, you know, all the men, women, and children that survived were taken in as slaves, and they'd have slave traders that essentially followed the army, behind the army, and would, you know, pay cash for slaves. Or you're, you know, similar to, you know, what the Jews did. If you couldn't afford to support your family, you would sell your children into slavery. So Rome, you know, started making more progressive laws towards their slaves, so that they, you know, were kind of, the historian I'm reading, you know, described it as kind of how we look at our dogs, you know, in our culture today. You know, if you mistreated your slaves or, you know, killed them, you were essentially like scorned by the Roman citizens. You know, if you murdered them, you could be brought to trial and executed yourself. So there was some advancement for, you know, slave rights, whatever that means, and you could free your slaves as well, and those were called freedmen. So that's important. So there, you know, if you think about it, the population of Rome, which I think was, I'd have to go back and look at it. I think it was approaching 10 million. So, you know, you're dealing with 4 million slaves. So also during this time period, Stoicism was becoming very popular. And one of the things that, you know, one of the primary tenets of Stoicism is that, you know, contentment comes from accepting what you cannot control and focusing on your own virtue rather than in external circumstances. So, you know, that may sound well and good if you're a Roman citizen or, you know, mid to high class, but if you're a slave or low class, you know, what am I supposed to accept my position in society and be content with that? So, you know, picture yourself as a slave or a lower class citizen in Rome being told by, you know, the aristocrats that your unhappiness isn't because of your position within society, but because of where your focus and efforts are aimed at. So Stoicism was more of a aristocrat, you know, movement. So then along comes this cult. So the Rome considered Christianity as, you know, as a cultish religion. So here along comes this cult that has teachings like, Holly, go ahead and read your verses.
Nevertheless, what do the scriptures say? Get rid of the slave woman and her son, for by no means will the son of the slave inherit along with the son of the free woman. So, brothers, we are children not of the slave woman, but of the free woman. What the Messiah has freed us for is freedom. Therefore, stand firm. Don't let yourselves be tied up again to a yoke of slavery.
Okay, go ahead, Megumi.
Nevertheless, when one turns to the Lord, the veil is taken away. Now the Lord is the Spirit, and where the Spirit is of the Lord is, there's liberty. But we all, with unveiled faces, beholding as in a mirror the glory of the Lord, are being transformed into the same image from glory to glory, just as by the Spirit of the Lord.
And then Paul.
John 8:30 and 31. Because he spoke this way, many came to believe in him. Jesus then said to those Jews who believed in him, if you remain in my word, you will truly be my disciples.
that John 8, 30, 31? Well, regardless.
31.
So, you know, up until this Christian movement, you know, the typical slave and lower class citizen would have been, you know, either worshiping the, you know, the Roman gods, or, you know, if they were somewhat like, you know, Greek slaves were very educated. In fact, they would come to rule Rome eventually, but so they either, you know, were exposed to philosophical ideas or Roman gods, but, you know, none of these movements offered this idea of freedom. And so, you know, as a slave or low class citizen, you know, this new idea of freedom, not freedom from, you know, their position within the Roman Empire, but a God that, you know, has a personal interest in the individual, and that he offers freedom. You know, I think that was one of the primary instruments as to why Christianity exploded. And as we'll get into, Christianity did exponentially grow within the Roman territory. And the majority of those were slaves and lower class citizens. So, you know, as we covered, this Christian movement migrated out away from the Judean province into Alexandria, down in Egypt, Asia Minor, Syria, and Greece. And many of these, you know, early believers, as I mentioned, were slaves, merchants, who traveled along trade routes, established communities in North Africa, Mesopotamia, Armenia, and Persia. So, whoops. So with this growing movement, there came challenges with it. So we talked about, let me skip forward here. So we talked about last class. So you have this, I'm kind of building this timeline. So you have this exponential growth within, you know, the regions I talked about, the territory of Rome. And then we have these issues of what initially kicked it off was a pseudo-epigraphy. So people, or, you know, essentially false teachers, people claiming to be, you know, either friends with, you know, one of the original apostles, claiming authority to you know, write and lead churches. And so, you know, in a response, you know, what's the easiest way to quench this? Well, it's to establish a authority to bring, you know, all these developing churches under, you know, someone that's can manage and prevent, you know, false teachings entering into the church. And so you have in the first form of hierarchy that's tries to be implemented, we have writings from Polycarp, who, you know, strictly opposes this formation of a hierarchy. So a couple of the individuals who were, you know, making efforts of establishing a hierarchy were Ignatius. So Ignatius writes in 110 AD that an individual, sorry, wrong one. Where did that go? Yeah, so one of them is Clement of Rome. So he was a bishop, within Rome. So he stated that he knew Peter and asserted that bishop's authority over multiple churches needs to be enacted. So that was one instance. And then you have Ignatius of Antioch. So he served as a bishop.
Is Clement considered pope?
In
Papal line from Peter?
he's considered a saint. I don't know if he's considered a pope.
I believe he is. But I don't know if he was recognized at the time.
Well, at the time, nobody was.
Yeah,
They go back and go, oh, from Peter, there's a succession.
yeah, they were called bishops at this time. And then you have Ignatius of Antioch. So he served as a bishop of Antioch, and he also advocated for a hierarchical church structure. So
there is a Clement
Clement of Rome.
is in the succession of popes, has here that he was from 88 to 97.
Yeah, that would be him.
Yep.
There was a few other individuals that are, at least, I think there's like 2 individuals before him that are considered in the line of the popes.
Who are those?
Well, Peter's
Linus.
one.
Yeah.
So after Peter is Linus, and then Anacletus.
Anacletus. So we have this establishment of a hierarchy, not, 50 years after the death of Messiah? Then we have another issue that arose in the churches is this idea of repentance. So an individual, there was a book that came out of Rome from an individual called Alcasai. And his ideas started becoming widespread among Christianity. So this book purported to contain a revelation made in the time of Trajan by the Son of God and the Holy Spirit in the form of angels, and teaching the forgiveness of all sins, even the grossest, by means of belief in doctrines of the book and baptism performed with certain peculiar rites. The controversy in regard to the forgiveness of gross sins committed after baptism was raging high at this time in Rome, and Hippolytus, who was a third century theologian, wrote who took the strict side, naturally opposed this new system of indulgence with the greatest vigor. Among other doctrines taught in the book was the lawfulness of denying the faith in time of persecution. So they said, kind of reminded me of the Quran. You could deny, there were times where you could deny God if you were in before persecution.
The rest of it sounds like it's straight out of Salt Lake City.
Yeah.
I wonder if that's the forerunner to that.
So it taught there was lawfulness to deny the faith in time of persecution, as told us by Origen in this chapter, and by Epiphanius in chapter 19. So just quoting from Hippolytus's. So Hippolytus was 3rd century. The book of Alcasai was in 110 AD.
Origin commented on it later, right?
Yeah. Yep. And then also you have the issue of baptism. So we already have strife about baptism arising. So in 185 AD is the first instance of instant baptism that we have knowledge of. So in the writings of Tertullian, he's writing to the churches to oppose the implementation of infant baptism.
Yeah, he's a pretty good Baptist.
Yep. So then shortly thereafter, we kind of have the split. So we have really what is the first Anabaptists arise in 156 AD.
Holly, can I ask you a question? which of these figures did the university identify with that you?
Like what names came up in my
In a
education?
positive manner.
So the school remained pretty neutral in terms of like, here are the historical facts as they were presented. There was no, the school didn't have a theological, well, there was no like we and they kind of discussion. It was, this is the Baptist history as we understand it, and Tertullian. I mean, the Elkisites is a new one. I don't
Me
recall.
too. I've never read anything about it.
But everything else, this is a pretty, I've seen similar-ish timelines. So I'm kind of
Just wonder what tack they took. Thank you.
Also, one thing I forgot to mention too, I should have put up there, in 170 AD, we have literature or writings that show that authority was given to bishops to forgive any kind of sin at any time. So this was a practice carried out by Dionysius, who was a bishop in Corinth. Is he mentioned in there? In your Pope lineage? Dionysius? Dionysius was, yeah, I think so.
It's an interesting name. Considering the Roman god Dionysus. Or the exact opposite. No, I guess he was Greek.
According to Wikipedia, he was a pope, 14th pope of the Patriarch of Alexander. Is that the right Dionysius?
What year?
No, that's not right. That's a different Dionysius.
Yeah, it's hard
There's
when
a
they
Dionysus from 259 to 268. I don't think that's the right age.
Yeah.
I think that's a little bit too late.
Wikipedia has a pope list.
So his Bible has a pope list too.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah, just so you know, Tertullian was essentially a Christian author with in Northern Africa. So next class we'll get into the Montanists. So they essentially are the first Anabaptists. So we have the split now between really what the the primary movement of Christianity, if you want, I guess for lack, we'll call it a Christian-like movement, and then you have the Montantists.
Well, it's Christian movement because the real Christians are in there too.
Montanists. Yeah.
So what sources did you get the Elkisites from, and what are you using for the Montanists?
The Elkisites are.
I've never read that.
Well, I'll get that to you after class. Yeah, so next class we'll get into the first Anabaptists. And then we'll get into Antoninus. So Antoninus, actually I could probably briefly go over him. So he's the next emperor after Hadrian. So Antoninus, I lost it. Oh, there we go. So Antoninus is said to have been ruled over Rome during the Golden Age of Rome. So, yeah. So initially, Hadrian's plan was to appoint, because when Antoninus took office, he was already pretty old. I think he was 50 years old. And so,
Just a kid.
so Hadrian had his eyes on Marcus and Lucius, two young boys, but they were too young to take office. So,
Like, what do you mean he had it?
no,
This is Rome.
I mean that wouldn't be unusual, but
That's Rome, you never know.
so his plan was to, put in Antoninus, who was already pretty seasoned. So, he would be in office enough time for Marcus and Lucius to kind of mature, and then he'd die in 10 years, and then Marcus and Lucius would take over. Well, he ended up living into his till he was like 75 or 76, so he was in office for a long time. So yeah, historians say he was the emperor over Rome during its golden age, because it was one of the longest period in Rome where, up to this point, where they had no wars, no major wars, always had, little skirmishes, but, and he was very frugal with Rome's treasury, but he, being a wealthy man, spent a lot of his own capital on the Roman citizens. So he was, highly, he was thought of as very highly. And so then next, after he dies, we get two emperors at the same time. First time in Roman history. So you get Marcus and Lucius, who are co-rulers of Rome. So we'll also get into that as well.
That won't end badly.
No, actually, given their personalities, Marcus was kind of the down to business, and Lucius, I mean, if you've ever seen any of the older movies they've made a few movies on these two. Lucius is always the party guy, kind of womanizer, like. So.
Is that the last gladiator? Wasn't there two emperors, brothers? No.
I haven't seen the last one. Yeah. So they actually fit pretty well together. Lucius wasn't really motivated politically, so he just liked to party, but he was smart, very smart guy. So yeah, that's all I got. Thank you.